Hello, my name is Nadine and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So today I'm going to teach you how to use these Gelli Arts jelly plates for making prints. You'll notice in this video that I'm not speeding anything up. I have experienced a lot of videos that make it look really easy, and jelly printing is easy, but there are some little tricks for getting this technique down to something that is really helpful for you. So as we get started on today's video, I wanted to show you the supplies that you will need for this project. To start with, you want some sort of jelly plate. You can either make jelly plates. I understand gelatin plate recipes are available on the internet. They are not meant for multiple uses. Well, these Gelli Arts plates are. There are a lot of different brands, but I particularly like the Gelli Arts plates because they actually are quite thick. If you look at them, they do have some heft to them, and I like that because it seems to hold the paint well. They don't move around as I work, and so for me, I find them really useful. I actually originally started with a 5x7 plate, but moved up to an 8x10 plate. They both have uses depending on what you're trying to do with them, but I like the 8x10 specifically. They also come in a lot of different sizes and shapes, circles. I believe they come in octagons as well as small squares. So there's lots of different sizes depending on what you want to use them for. I also will be using stamps, stencils. You'll need a brayer. I am using some Staples 90-pound cardstock as well as some black cardstock. You can also use just regular printer paper. You can use really anything that you have on hand for paper. It doesn't necessarily have to be super thick, but I like using slightly thicker paper just because of the application I use these for in my art projects. I'm also using mostly the Pabio Studio acrylics, but I do have some Dilutions paint and some Dina Wakley paint that I was hoping to start using up, so I will also be using those as we go along. I'm also going to try out using some golden retarder on some of these prints to kind of help the paint spread a little bit better. So let's get started on today's project. So the first thing that you want to do is actually remove your jelly plate from its packaging. You want to make sure you take the acrylic sheets off and put down your jelly plate on the mat. The next thing you're going to want to do is actually add a little bit of paint. So this is where it gets kind of interesting, because when I started jelly printing, I was watching all sorts of videos, and a lot of them were like, oh, throw some paint on and off you go, and it's so easy. And I had moments of like, this is really not working for me. So the key with it is to actually put a little bit of paint on your surface. The key is trying to find that nice balance between not having too much paint and having enough paint. Because if you have too much paint, it slides around a lot and you won't necessarily get really great prints. And if there's not enough, I actually like having a little bit of a thicker print than maybe what is considered normal. So I want to use up some of my old paint, so some of this Dilutions paint that I am just putting a little bit on the surface as well with a palette knife. The one thing with this is you want to make sure you're using plastic tools and you're using tools that will not scratch the plate. The plate itself, it will get marred and scratched if you are not careful. So something to consider as you are making these prints. I'm also going to throw a little bit of retarder on this, and you'll see as I start mixing the paint how it's going to help things spread and get smoother. So you take your big brayer and you actually want to start moving your paint around. And in this case, try to make sure you're using colors that work together. So for example, blue and red do make purple, so I'm not going to end up with a complete mess when I do that. And so you want to add paint to the whole surface. It should be fully covered. You should not be able to see the plate through it. Now the next thing is to actually put your designs in your plate. So you have lots of options. I'm going to start first with a really simple option, which is using these rubber mark making tools. You really can use anything, but you need to make sure that it will not be sharp. It will not scratch your jelly plate. In this case, you don't want to use a knife. You don't want to use anything that is sharp in any way. You want to use something that has a lot of movement to it, that is very supple, so that you do not damage your plate. Because once it has a scratch in it, you'll see that scratch in every following print that you make. So in this case, I'm just going to do a really simple little swirly pattern. Basically, you want to take your paper, press it firmly on, and give it a good press. And this is where if you have too much paint on it, it'll start wiggling. If you don't have enough paint on it, it's not going to make a really great impression. So there you can see, and that one I had a little too much paint on it, because you can see that there is a little bit of the markings in it, but it didn't necessarily go through as well as I would like it to. But the key with this is to have enough paint that when you actually want to do a second impression, it does actually pick up some paint. So in this case, I could leave it as is, or I could also run my tool through it again to try to get it to have slightly stronger marks in it. Take that one and just press it well. And there you go. So there you can see a lot more of the variation. So that first print, I actually used a little bit too much paint on it. So you can see that's where that balance needs to come in, where you're not adding too much paint, but you are also able to use enough paint where you kind of get the job done. And because there's still a fair amount of paint on this surface, I am actually going to make a third print. I generally don't usually make third prints, but in this case, I'm going to make an exception because I can add, again, additional layers to these prints. This is actually the first layer of the printing process. And there you go. It's kind of blotchy. It has a lot more texture, but again, when you add other prints on top of it, it's going to look more interesting. So now that you have a bunch of paint on the surface still, what do? And you have lots of paint on your brayer. Don't wash your brayer, do not wash your jelly plate. This is where you can get some really interesting stuff. So first thing I usually do is just clean off my brayer on the surface. And now I'm going to use some other colors. I'm going to use some yellow. I'm going to use a little bit of pink. And we'll see what we end up getting. So now I want to add some stamps to this image. So there's lots of things. You can get the ones that are more the block stamps where it actually shows the majority of the image, or you can get the ones that are more the outline of the image. So depending on what you're trying to do, you can get a couple different looks depending on what type of stamp you want to use. In this case, I'm just going to use this large stamp. The one thing you want to make sure you do is actually clean those stamps right after you use them, just so that you don't end up with any problems with trying to clean them when the paint is all dry. So in that first print, the print didn't come through a lot, but you can see that more slight variation of color. You can see how the red from below actually ended up transferring on, and you can see the white for where the image was the strongest and where it picked up the majority of the paint. And I always take a second print. Sometimes I find the second prints are almost better than the first prints. And there's no point in leaving a lot of paint on your jelly plate. So there you can see more of the flower image that time around, just because of the way the paint reacted with the surface. And I'm actually going to clean my stamp a bit. And that's why I actually have a white sheet underneath here, so I can always stamp off on my image below. So I am actually going to take a third print. There you go. You get some of the prints that were underneath and a little bit of the paint that was there. But also, as I was cleaning my stamp off on there, you can see the different images that I ended up getting as well. So again, I'm going to clean my brayer off. And if you didn't want to actually clean your entire brayer off on this, or you wanted to leave it half and half, this is also where you take advantage of this paper that you have. And again, like once I get a lot of prints and a lot of off texture on this paper, I will actually take it and I will work on it a little bit, adding some patterns or whatever that kind of bring all the cohesion together. And then this can be a background to another project or something else that I am working on. So I'm moving a lot with the reds, and a lot of the reasons I use the reds is I like using them for some of my underpaintings for my projects. So by using some of these colors, I end up having something that really works well. And that is way too much paint. So I am just going to take some on my brush and put it to the side here, and I will use it after. So now instead of just using the stencil itself, I can also make some lines underneath it as well. And this is a very subtle look. There we go. So again, you don't have to stick with only one thing that you do on these prints. You can do multiple things on these prints. So basically, I'm leaving the stencil on the paper this time, which is going to leave a really interesting print. And in this case, you really do want to push down well, and you want to make sure it's getting in between all of those layers of stencil, because the stencil does give it a little bit of space in between the paper and the print. You need to press down and make sure that it transfers well. And there you go. And so if you're looking for a bold print, that's a good way of going about it. So now I'm going to pull off the stencil. And I'm going to pull another print. So with this print, you can see that it's actually pulled up some of the color that was already on the Gelli plate that had been left for the last few prints. It also shows the other image of the stencil. And so this is where you can actually end up with some really interesting things that happen as you go on with these prints. So make sure that you don't just always clean your plate or always do the same thing by just kind of leaving things to go and seeing what you can kind of come up with. You can come up with some really interesting things. So now that I have my extra paint from before, and again, I'm using a plastic tool so that I do not mar my image. Now I'm going to go in with some buff titanium. I don't usually use white on this. I usually use a buff titanium color. And if you'll notice, I'm using mostly Pebeo paints. I do find that Pebeo especially is good with this type of technique. There is something about the consistency of the paint that I find goes on easy. Actually does make really great prints. Holds up well. The color is really excellent. And the Pebeos are not super expensive. So if you're like me and you spend a lot of time doing a lot of fine art painting and you're trying to save a little bit of money on materials, it's not a bad way to go, just to like get your paints to go further. So now I'm going to add in a few different things. So this here is an image I actually used my Cricut to create. I took an image that was already there and I made it larger. And so there is no end to things that you can actually use to add texture to your prints. In this case, I'm actually using some drywall tape just to add extra interest. In this case, I'm pressing it down and lifting it up, and it's going to add a very fine texture in that paint. Sometimes it's fun to go really bold with things, and sometimes it's really interesting to just see what you can do that's a little bit more subtle. And I usually rub my hand up and down the paper, but at the same time, then when I have these larger images, I do some extra pressing on the edges here, just to make sure that we get a really good transfer of image. So you can see I have the big negative space from the image there, and as well you can see all these tiny little bits of texture from the drywall tapes. So again, like, it really kind of comes down to, do you want something bold or do you want something subtle, or do you want a combination of both? And now I'm going to run my second print. And again, very different than that first print. So to use a clean your Gelli plate, usually I spray it with a little bit of water, and then I actually follow up with a little bit of hand sanitizer. Usually when I am done working, I actually do spray the whole thing. I actually do wash the whole thing in a sink with water, but as I'm working, this seems to be like not a bad way to get it mostly clean. Now, since I have some leftover Dilutions paint, not really leftover, more paint I have not used in a very long time. And so I'm going to try to use some of this stuff up in these projects. And as long as you're very careful with your tools, you don't usually have much of an issue with this. I try not to always go with the dark colors, so I'm throwing some light blue in. Just try to brighten this up a little bit. So I'm going to find another large image to use. A mask. And I'm actually going to put some bubble wrap on it. Bubble wrap, I just love the effect of bubble wrap on a project. And because you can get it in large sizes and small sizes, for me, I just grab things when things come in the mail, and I make sure if it's a different type of bubble wrap that I actually pick some up. Again, you can re-stamp this on something else, or you can leave it to dry. And you can see I didn't press very hard on the image, so it's actually a much larger image, or a lot more of a larger block of white on there. There you can go, you can see those great bubble marks and a little bit of the swirl that goes through it. So I'm going to add some buff titanium. I'm going to use some of this cheap permanent violet. I got this cheap paint on sale, and it was already cheap, ha ha ha. But, you know, it's kind of fun to use different stuff. And if you have too much of a glob there, you can always take your palette knife and move it around. Actually, use Pebeo Teal. So that should go actually nicely together. This will be a slightly lighter print than some of the other ones. And because I didn't clean my brayer or put all the paint on, I ended up with some of the red coming through that was already on the brayer, which is also great. And let's see if we can get it to come through really well on this. Make sure you hold one hand in place and then you move around with the other one, because that's how you're going to make sure that you don't end up with a really wonky, wobbly image. And there you go. I think that's pretty cool. With that already on there, you could actually even just throw it on another piece of paper. And I think that alone also makes for an interesting background. So it's important to remember that you don't necessarily need to limit yourself with any of this. Just keep printing and seeing what you kind of come up with. And there you go. So that print actually came up with all the colors underneath, the reds and everything else. The actual texture itself is more subtle, but again, sometimes you want that on a page. So now I want to talk about doing stuff on black paper. The important thing is when you're using black paper, you want to use light colors. Definitely don't go dark on dark, because it's not going to actually turn out in the way that you would really prefer. Throw some silver on there. Throw some green. And I'm going to use one of my homemade stencils that I use with my Cricut. And actually in this case, I'm just going to very carefully use my plastic palette knife. I'm just going to do some swirlies. Little dots. Look at this, is doodling with paint. You could have also just left this alone and just printed the image itself. There you go. You get some of the colors up above and some of the colors underneath. And again, it gives a completely different look to the paper once you actually add black paper to the print. Pull that off. And do a second print. Which that ended up being really cool. I usually try not to do more than 3 colors on a thing. Sometimes I only do 2. That also helps with not ending up with too much mud or too many colors. And as you can see, just by not cleaning your plate, you end up getting other bits of color on it anyways. So it's something to think about when you are printing. And in this case, I am not even going to put the whole, I am putting it down. I'm going to use this to make sure it makes a good impression. But this time I'm not leaving it on the stencil. I've made my mark. And there you go. So again, if you don't want to have that really white imprint, but you actually want a stronger print, you can actually put it on and pull it off, and it gives you that little bit of interest and allows the black to come through a little bit more. And the black really does have its own thing going on when you're actually using it for prints. And in this case, I know it's not going to print all that interesting, so I'm just going to throw a few extra lines in. And there you go. You can see the lines and you can also see the overall print. So that's how you do your first layer of jelly printing. In the next video, I will be showing you how, after these are dry, how to add a second layer. Thank you for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and provide a comment below. I hope that you have a great week, and I will see you next time.